Hi everybody. This week we're going to do a couple of images to do with Valentine's Day directly, but you know, you could make them and send them to anybody you love. Doesn't just have to be a partner or whatever, but you know, particularly at the moment I think we need to share the love. So you know, do a few paintings, make a few cards, send them to the people that you love, and hopefully we'll make the world a better place. You can do these directly onto watercolour paper and fold it in half and make a card, or you can do a couple of images, print them on your computer and make them into cards, cut them out, stick them down, or take them to a printer and get them printed properly. It's up to you. But first of all, I'm just having a sip of coffee. We're going to do them in pen and watercolour, or you can do them in ink. You could even do them in acrylic. It's up to you, but I'm going to use pen and watercolour. So if you're doing it in acrylic, what you do is you make the painting and then you do the pen bit on top. If you're doing it in watercolour, you can do it either way. You can paint your colour on first, put the pen on top, or the opposite, but I'll explain that in a minute. If you're doing it in ink, you need to follow the same rules as for the watercolour. Okay, you can do it in watercolour pencil or pencil crayon or pen, even felt tips. It's up to you. You might just like the image as it is and do it in pen, you know, in felt tips, you know, it's up to you. But if you're going to do it in watercolour or ink, which is a water-based medium, you need to test out your pens, because if you're going to do your drawing first and put the watercolour over the top, you don't want your pens to run. So if you only have pens that are water soluble, then do the colour bit first and then put the pen on top. If your pens are permanent pens, then you can draw your image out and put the colour on top. Some pens say they're permanent and they're not. Some pens say they're water soluble and they're not. So always test them before you use them. So I've got here, I've got a few pens. I've got a Beryl Italic, I've got a normal Bic pen, I've got a CD marker, I've got a Beryl fine liner, and I've got a Sharpie. Those are basically the black pens that I have in my set. So I'm just going to put a mark down for each one, and I'm just going to simply run a line of water across them and see which ones move and which ones stay put. Okay, and you know, you can do this in a sketchbook and keep it as a reference for later if you want. So I've got some dirty water here. And I'm just going to put, and you can see immediately that that Beryl Italic, that one, is water soluble. Some pens are also water soluble when they're wet. So that's the other thing to check, is if they're water soluble when they're wet and if they're water soluble when they're dry. So let the pen dry off a bit as well and do another test, right? So that's definitely, you can see. So this one, this Beryl fine liner, fine, is definitely water soluble, as is this. It's a Beryl Italic. I mean, you know, sometimes it can make really nice effects. You can see that that effect there is quite lovely. So you might be able to use it to your advantage. That's a Sharpie. Most Sharpies are water permanent, but I use Sharpies in my garden to label my plants, and they, over time, they wash off. So they might be water soluble, but the wet does get underneath them. So that's permanent. And washes them away. So they're long term, they are water soluble. But because we're doing a painting and we're just going to put a layer of water over it and it's going to dry, we don't need to worry about that. So even the Bic pen is permanent. You find that quite a few just normal writing pens are permanent. So then it's up to you to decide which one you use on your picture. All right, so test your markers out before you, let me just zoom in on that, before you use them. Same applies to coloured markers. You can do the same test with different pencils, because some lead moves more than others. Coloured pencils, watercolour pencils, you can do the same test. Just run a line of water over the top and see what happens to them. All right, just do that before you make a decision about what you're going to paint. So the next stage is to set yourself up. Now I've just got an A5 piece of watercolour paper here, and I've just put masking tape around the edges. I've got thin masking tape, which is half the thickness of normal masking tape. And then I've drawn out very lightly my hands and my face on here, and I'm going to now go over my lines with pen. And because I'm working on a small scale, I'm going to use my Bic pen because it leaves a fine line. If you're working larger, so if you've split an A4 piece of paper, that's double this size, in half, you know, you might get away with using a fine liner pen or even a Sharpie. But I'm going to put it on time lapse so that you can watch me do it. Okay, so we've tested our pens. Next thing to do is to just practice a couple of sunsets. Okay, so what you can do is one of two things. You can either do your sunset wet in wet. I'm just going to use the scrap paper on the side of my test piece, which is on the back, and you can wet the area that you want the sunset to be in, like this. So this is wet in wet, what they call wet in wet. So you wet the paper first. Some of you will know this already, some of you might not. And then you take whatever colours you want to use in your sunset. So is it sunset, is it sunrise, you know, the sky will be different. Look online at some photographs and see. So I always put the lightest colour in first. So I'm going to put some yellow in, and then some orange. So what happens with this method, wet in wet, is that the colours will blend together, and then a little bit of red at the top, like so. And you can do this with any colour, you know, you can do blue skies like this. They're always lighter on the horizon. And you can pick up your paper, oops, you can sort of pick up your paper and tip it around like this, and you'll find that the colours will just run into one another. Again, it's practice, but just have a go at it, have a play around, do several different versions, and you'll see that the colours start to blend. You can sort of manipulate the colours a little bit, but I tend to sort of not to fiddle too much, because you sort of lose that lovely softness that you have. this method is mainly about controlling the water and the amount of pigment you put on. Don't put too much, mix your colours first, put the water down and then add the paint. You don't want it to dry off on you. That's wet in wet, or wet on wet, some people call it. Okay, but you can see that the colours are merging quite nicely with that one. So the opposite is to not wet the paper. You get a completely different, you get less of a sort of hazy look. And we just put this, so wet your colours first, wet all of them. So put some water on your yellow, put some water on your orange, mix it so it's wet, and then the same with the red. And then again, start with your yellow, start with the lightest colour first. So we've got the yellow there, and then wash your brush off a little bit and sort of wipe it off on the edge, wipe it off on the edge of your pot so it's not too soaking. And then add your orange in, and you can sort of mix it a little bit. Wipe your brush off again, wipe it off on the edge, and then add some red. Okay, and then, you know, you can encourage it to blend a little bit, but the colour does dry quicker this way, so you haven't got as much time to sort of get the blending to happen as you do with the excuse me, the wet in wet method. But try both, try blending different colours. This is called a graduation of colour, or a gradation, some people call them. So this is wet on dry. Split your paper, get an old piece of paper or the back of a piece of paper, split it up into sections and just play with getting these colours to mix together and to blend together before you have a go at your main picture. If you're using acrylic paint, you mix up the yellow and the orange and the red in advance. You put some yellow down first, and then add a touch of orange in, and then add a touch of red, and just blend away with your brush. What we tend to do with acrylic is we put the colour down, blend it a little bit, and then if you take a dry brush like this and just lightly go over the areas that join together, that will help you to blend it. So this is like a dry brush technique, they call it. But again, it is just experimenting with amounts of paint, how much water to put in, and the type of brushes that you use. So just play with it. The only way you can learn about blending colours together is by playing and experimenting and writing down what you've done. Make a record, use it almost like a diary. Okay, have a go, and then I will move on to the addition of colour on the main picture. So here we are, I've filled those hands in, I'm ready to paint. I've got some clean water and I've already got my colours. I've got water and I've got my colours wet. So I've got yellow, orange, red, already wet. I'm going to do this one wet and wet, and I'm going to do this one wet on, the other one wet on dry, so that you can see both techniques. So ideally you should have a nice big brush like this Chinese brush, a wash brush. Okay, just lots of hairs, soft because it's watercolour, to put the water on with, because we want this to happen quite quickly. There's a sort of timing element with wet in wet. So I'm going to try and get the water down on and hope to goodness that my colour doesn't run, right, after all that work. which it hasn't done. And then I'm going to take the yellow and I'm going to add yellow in like this. And then I'm going to add orange like that. A bit stronger up the top. Make sure your colours are mixed nicely before you do this. And then I'm going to add red at the very top and bring it down to join with the... Right, so now I'm going to pick it up. I'm just going to wipe that bit up off the desk and I'm just going to let it run. Pick it up, move it around, let it run around. If you get any pooling, that's where the colours collect in pools. I'll show you what to do with that in a minute. Okay, so I'm quite happy with that. As soon as you're happy, let the painting rest. I've got some orange now in my sky, so I'm just going to move that around a bit. Let it flood downwards a bit, I think. Okay, so I've got some pooling. That's just excess water, excess paint here. Just going to take the edge of a paper towel or a piece of cloth or whatever and just try and absorb some of that excess fluid. Okay, run it around, keep it running around, and sooner or later it will just settle. So you can see I've got a little bit of cockling happening here. That's just where the paper has become excessively wet. So I'm just going to push that down to that corner. I'm going to take my paper towel and I'm just going to lift off a little bit of that excess paint. Can you see? This is done before it dries. You must do it before it dries. You can't do this afterwards. Okay, just a little bit. And again, like I said, it is just experimentation. You might have to do this 2 or 3 times in order to get it exactly how you want it and not to be cockling or pooling. Now if you've got what is called a block, that is a watercolour block, it's basically a watercolour sketchbook which is called a block, and what they've done is when they've made the sketchbook they glue around the outside of the sketchbook and that holds the paper flat, so you don't have this issue when you have loose paper of cockling and things curling. You can see my paper's curled slightly. So I always recommend, if you're working in watercolour, that you get yourself a watercolour block. Have a look online, they sell them online. They're really useful. Traditionally, watercolour paper would have been stretched. So all watercolour paper would have been loose leaf. And each artist would have cut a piece and then stretched it using gum strip to hold it tight so it doesn't cockle. But the solution these days is to use a watercolour block. So anyway, there we go. We got a sunset behind our hands. It might not be strong enough for you. It's not strong enough for me, I don't think. But I'm just going to leave it that way. I might work into it afterwards. Alright, so that's that one for now. Let's try this one. And the good thing about this, working on multiple pieces, is you get to have another go at it. So this time I'm going to use some blue in my sky. So I'm going to use some indigo or phthalo blue. The only thing you've got to be careful of with adding blue and yellow into your sky is that if you mix it together it goes green. Blue and yellow make green, so make sure that those colours don't meet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some yellow down the bottom again, yellow down the bottom, So this is wet on dry, remember. So the paper is not wet first. Wet on dry. You've got to work quicker with this method. A bit of orange. A bit of red. Oops, my little pan just popped out of its... and I'm going to take the red up in a curve. And I'm going to try and blend it a bit with the orange. Now, before it dries out, I'm just going to take a semi-dry brush and I'm just going to push those colours together. Make sure I've got my edges in. And do that. Don't use any more water though, okay? Because you'll find that if you do that, it'll get in a mess. So now we're going to go into the blue. I'm going to put the blue at the top here. And then I'm going to take a little bit of water on my brush, put it underneath, and I'm just going to now bring it together with the red. Can you see how that's happening? Nice and lightly. Now this is drying off. Don't fiddle too much. I'm going to leave that now. The more you fiddle, the more likely you are to get into a mess. So again, lift off any carefully. Don't do this in the middle because you'll end up with marks. You can only do this round the outside. There's a funny mark there. I'm just going to try and get rid of that. Okay, leave it alone. Don't fiddle. You'll make it worse. Okay, so there's a different sky. It's a good chance to have a practice at those skies. Mixing colours, blending, using different techniques. Okay, and if you find that some of the colour has bonded to your pen, which it will do, you can either leave it, because sometimes it looks really nice, or you can just go over it again afterwards with the same pen. You can add some hills in, you can put some birds in the sky. I'm just going to let this dry off and then I'll come back to it. Okay, so it's dry now. So you can leave it like that. If you like it, leave it, right? Otherwise, you can add some extra bits in. If you're a fussy person and you want to add some more bits and bobs in, then you can. So you can take some red and you could go in and you could add some lines up here. So almost like clouds, some little details in the sky. But again, this is down to you. If you liked it the way it was, then just leave it alone. Don't fuss with it. If you want to soften those clouds, just add some water in. Just play. And you can do that with all the colours. You know, you can come down and do a bit of orange, going across the hand like that. You know, it's really up to you to play with your work and you know, just enjoy what you're doing. Yeah, okay. Again, if it's strong, I don't know whether you can see that, but you can see the yellow's gone over the hand. You can either just lift it off using a wet brush like this, just lift it off, or you can go over it again afterwards with a pen. All right, so that's one aspect. You can even add some clouds in if you want. This one, I've just put my finger there and it was still wet, and there's a little cauliflower here, but who cares? I like it. Okay, so you might want to put in a couple of birds, and you can just do this with a pencil. You know, you don't have to do it in black pen. Sometimes black pen can be a bit harsh for things. So a couple of birds in the sky. You could even put some mountains in the distance. But I think, you know, it really depends on how big you're going to do these things. You know, you can do it in pen, but please, you know, make sure you get a nice fine pen rather than a thick sort of chunky Sharpie. It's going to just make your birds look really heavy. You need to keep them in perspective. Okay, and like I said, if you don't like this sort of aspect of yellow going on here, you could always put some lines back in. All right, there we go. So I know, shall we take this off? Let's just take this off now. I don't know if you remember, let me just zoom out a bit on here. I said that if you have trouble taking off your masking tape, just put your hairdryer on, point it, I don't know if you can see that, the hairdryer is pointing, and what that does is it just melts the glue and stops the glue from ripping your paper off. Okay, so carefully take that tape off. I'm just going to turn this off because I want to speak to you. I'm just going to carefully try and take this off without tearing it. You know, the other thing that people do is that they dab off the excess stickiness on their clothes. So before you stick your tape down, just pat it. Pat the gluey side onto your clothing, and you'll find that that just takes off that small amount that basically is what tears your paper. You can see there's a little bit of, oh, you can see that, see? Right, I'll just fill that in afterwards. There. Take off the tape. Oh, I'm just rushing this so that you can see it. Okay. And the benefit of having the tape on is it does create a little border so that when you come to frame something, so if you wanted to frame this, you could frame it up to the edge and the framer would have something to stick your work to, rather than having to frame over the top of your image. That's one of the reasons why. So you can see that's lovely. Really lovely now. All right, so just a couple of ideas there. Go looking online, there's so many pictures for Valentine's Day and for Santa's Stoinwen Day, which was a couple of weeks ago, of love heart shaped romantic imagery. Go and have a look. You could even do one for your pet if you're that mad, which I know some of us are. And also we've got Chinese New Year coming up. I think it's this week or next week, and they send cards to one another to tell each other that they care about one another and send money and all that sort of thing. So it's a nice thing to do. Send a friend a bit of love. Okay, see you next time. Bye for now.